In the grim darkness of the future, there is only war. You are one of the Emperor's elite, a space marine tasked with defending the Imperium of man from threats, both outside and within. The mutant, the heretic, the alien, all will fall beneath your wrath. I'm Darcblade, and welcome to my class guide to the Bulwark in Space Marine 2. In this video we will cover the basics of the class, as well as the weaponry at their disposal, the best builds, and a little bit of the lore behind the class. Speaking of which, the Bulwark, in terms of lore and the tabletop, could be referred to as a Blade Guard veteran. These are highly elite Primaris Marines, so they're not firstborn Marines, that tend to specialise in melee combat. Thanks to their elite status and experience, these veterans are normally assigned to first companies of Space Marine chapters. Armed with various melee weapons, storm shields, and a variety of pistols, they can advance upon the enemy whilst taking a hail of incoming fire and remain unscathed. After which, should they reach melee combat with their foes, their opponents will normally find themselves outmatched when it comes to taking on these melee specialist Space Marines. Now, when it comes to the weaponry the Bulwark has in Space Marine 2, unfortunately, much like the Assault Marine, it has no primary weapon, instead having access to various secondary weapons and especially melee weapons. So first of all, when it comes to the secondary weapons, it has access to the basic bolt pistol, the sidearm that all Space Marines have. It's a all-round weapon with no glaring flaws or major upsides. The Bulwark then has access to the plasma pistol, which is an incredibly useful and versatile weapon that can pack a punch. It can be charged up to unleash harder hitting shots, and its only real downside is its slow fire rate. And then finally you have access to the Neo-Volkite pistol that allows the Bulwark to fire a beam of thermal energy at opponents, to which when that thermal energy builds up, it will cause an explosion on that enemy, damaging the allies around them. But what about the melee weapons? Well, first of all, the Bulwark has access to the chainsword, that despite being a default melee weapon for most classes, is actually very versatile and useful. You then have access to the Power Fist, which is a slow weapon but it hits very hard. And then finally you have access to the Power Sword, which at the time of this video the Bulwark is the only class that has access to the Power Sword. This weapon is a very versatile weapon, but it has some complexity to it, as it can switch between two modes, one aimed at faster combos that are good at taking on individual opponents, and a powered up mode that is slower but better at taking on waves of opponents and cleaving through them. As for the armour the Bulwark wears, is equipped with the Mark 10 Tacticus Power Armour, which is the standard armour that all Primaris Marines wear. In terms of gameplay, this translates to 3 pips of armour. But there is another tool available to the Primaris Marine, which is the Storm Shield. This is more than just a standard shield, as it's equipped with an internal gravitic energy field generator, allowing it to block a lot of incoming attacks. This is done by holding L1 or LB on controller, and if you're on PC, this is done by holding C, basically holding the parry button. It should be noted as well that simply sprinting with the Bulwark will cause it to raise its shield, blocking incoming damage. But in Space Marine 2, every Marine has access to an ability or skill that is unique to their class. Access to arguably one of the most useful skills in the game, not only in terms of defense, offense, but also utility and healing, in the form of the chapter banner. When activated, the Bulwark will place a banner in the ground, which gradually restores armor to all squad mates within its area of effect. This can be augmented in various ways to increase our damage, increase our defense, or even grant us more contested health to which we can heal so long as we're damaging opponents. But every Astartes can augment their abilities and class via perks. This enables players to create builds for their Space Marine. The Bulwark's default perk, which can be found by hovering over the chapter banner ability in the perk customization screen, basically increases the class's health by 20%, adding to its survivability. You then move on to core perks, to which are divided into certain columns. For column 1, you have access to Conviction. When all your armor is depleted, you will take 25% less health damage for 5 seconds. Another defensive perk there. You then have Intimidating Aura, to which after a perfectly timed parry, you will deal damage in a small area of effect around you. This is around 5 meters. And then finally you have Forward Momentum. After a shield bash, your melee damage will be increased by 25% for 5 seconds. All of these are good choices, with my 2 personal favourites being Intimidating Aura if you want an AoE kind of build, or Forward Momentum if you like to get that increase in melee damage so long as you remember to use your shield bash. As for column 2, you have Armour of Contempt, When you block a ranged attack, enemies within 10 meters will take damage instead. So as long as you're remembering to use your shield to block enemy ranged attacks, you can deal damage back at them. You then have shock and awe. Enemies in the shock area take 25% more damage. You may ask what the shock area is, but we'll get into that in a moment. This is a perk that synergizes really well with two other perks in the Bulwark perk customization tree. And then finally you have scrambled targeting. If you are surrounded by 5 or more enemies, you will take 20% less range damage from your opponents. Again, another defensive perk that is actually quite useful, as most of the time your main source of damage against you is from ranged attacks when it comes to the Bulwark. As for column 3, you have defensive advantage, to which a perfectly timed block or parry creates a shock area for 5 seconds. This is on a 30-second cooldown. This basically translates to you dropping a shock grenade at your feet, dealing damage to opponents and staggering them at the same time. This also works in unison with the perk we mentioned, shock and awe, as enemies within this shock radius will be taking 25% more damage. You then have Still Within. When your health is less than 50%, you'll take 25% less health damage. Another defensive perk there. And then finally you have Armor Reinforcement. Non-finisher gun strikes will also restore your armor, a great survivability perk. However, when it comes to picking the perks, you either want to consider going for defensive advantage, so you get that shock area for 5 seconds, or the armor reinforcement. On the lower difficulties, or if you're going up against opponents where there are a lot of waves, i.e. Tyranids, defensive advantage could be potentially more beneficial, but armor reinforcement is generally the one I tend to go for. But anyway, we will talk more about these perks in the build section of this video. Anyway, you then have team perks, which are perks that benefit not only you, but your entire team. First of all, you have Unyielding Ceramite. The delay before armor begins to passively regenerate itself has been reduced by 5 seconds, up to a base of 25 seconds for all squad members, adding to a little bit of survivability for everyone. You then have Advanced Conditioning. Contested health fades 50% more slowly for all squad members. Contested health is the white health that you can regenerate through attacking opponents. And then you have Effective Formation. All squad members take 20% less health damage from Terminus level enemies. These are boss level enemies, so the Hive Tyrant, Carnifex, Hellbrute, so on and so forth. Personally, out of these ones, Advanced Conditioning is the one I pick, allowing our contested health to fade 50% more slowly. But then you have Gear perks, which are perks that benefit the Chapter Banner and your Storm Shield. For column 1 you have Concussive Force. Basically this allows your Shield Bash to deal more damage. The second option is Rapid Regeneration. Your banner will restore armor 300% more quickly, but its duration has been reduced by 5 seconds. This is good for a quick heal. And then finally you have Focus Strength. Your Shield Bash will now knock enemies back and make them lose control for a longer period of time. Good at stunning enemies and leaving them vulnerable. Focus Strength and Concussive Force is definitely worth considering, especially if you take the core perk in column 1, Forward Momentum. As for column 2, you have Purity of Purpose. The banner deals a small amount of damage over time to enemies within its area of effect, allowing the banner to deal some AoE damage. You'll then have Merciless Resolve. After a Shield Bash, you do not lose control upon taking heavy hits, and you cannot be knocked back for 5 seconds. And then finally you have Invigorating Icon, which in my opinion is probably the most valuable perk for the Bulwark. When you activate the Chapter Banner, all squad members regain maximum contested health. What this means is your entire health bar will be filled up white, to which obviously dealing damage, or especially in this case a finisher on opponents, you'll be able to restore your health. Given the Bulwark, at the time of this video, the only class that is able to potentially allow their squad mates and themselves to restore their entire health bar. As for column 3, you have Rejuvenating Effect. When the banner is activated, it revives incapacitated squad members within its area of effect. Good for a quick revive, and especially if you're not playing with bots. You then have Glory's Shield. All squad members within the banner's area of effect take 10% less damage. Good if you're defensive focused. And then you have Inspiration. All squad members within the banner's area of effect deal 10% more damage. Good if you're offense focused. To be honest, taking either Inspiration or Glory's Shield is down to personal preference, especially if you are playing with bots, as they don't go down often. But if you are playing with 2 human players, Rejuvenating Effect is probably worth taking. And then finally you have Signature perks, which are unique perks that add some sort of unique aspect to the character. First of all, you have emergency countermeasure. When your armor is depleted, a reserve shock grenade automatically detonates at your position. This comes with a 120-second cooldown. But this can work in unison with the shock and awe perk found in the core perks, giving us a small area where enemies in it take more damage. Good for AoE focused builds. You then have defensive mastery. After a perfectly timed block or parry, you'll instantly incapacitate Majoris or extremist level enemies. This comes with a 120-second cooldown. This is incredibly useful at getting rid of high priority targets, as once they're incapacitated, you can perform finishes on them. And then you have Armored Advance. If you have armor remaining, you do not lose control upon taking heavy hits, and you cannot be knocked back. Personally, out of these, I would take Defensive Mastery, or if I'm running with the Shock and Awe Shock Grenade build, I'd recommend Emergency Countermeasures. But when it comes to taking on the enemies of the Imperium, you can be more effective when you specialise in certain weapons and perks, thus creating builds. In this guide I will be showing you two builds that I use for the Bulwark, which are aimed at taking on the higher difficulties. The first build I refer to as the Shock and Awe build, which is focused on the shock grenade aspect of the Bulwark, combined with AoE damage and survivability. And the second I simply referred to as the Blade Guard Veteran build, which is more of a general purpose build. So for the Shock and Awe build, when it comes to the weaponry, you'll first want to take either the Plasma Pistol or the Neo Volkite Pistol. You can also take the Bolt Pistol if you so wish, especially if you don't get on with the other two weapons. I personally would normally always take the Plasma Pistol over the other two weapons, as despite its slow rate of fire and slow moving projectile, to which you have to lead your shot sometimes, it allows you to interrupt opponents by performing charge shots, stopping them from calling for backup. Our secondary weapons, as we will be focused more on dealing melee damage. Regardless though of which pistol you take, I would recommend taking the one that has the most amount of ammunition reserves. This is because on the harder difficulties you will burn through ammo quite quickly, and it can be difficult to replenish it. You will also have to consider your allies as well, which, to be honest, most of the time will have access to better ranged weapons than you, and thus they may have first dibs on restoring their ammo. On the lower difficulties though, this doesn't matter whatsoever. I would personally advise holding off using your secondary until you encounter an enemy you cannot reach in melee. Zoanthropes, Neurothropes, or enemies at a distance who are calling for allies, this is where your secondary comes into play. But anyway, as for the perks for the Plasma Pistol, I'd first recommend taking Fast Venting, to which our weapon cools down 15% faster. I'd then take Rampage. After killing 10 or more enemies in rapid succession, you'll deal 25% more damage for 5 seconds, but this comes with a 30-second cooldown. I'll then take Supercharged Shot. Damage from a charged shot is increased by 10%. I'll then take Great Might. Damage increased by 10% against Terminus level enemies, so bosses and such. I'll then take Plasma Collection. Energy reserves of the plasma weapon is increased by 20%, adding to our ammo. I've then gone up to Perpetual Velocity. You can charge your shots 20% faster. I've then gone over to Efficient Charge. Charge shots from the plasma weapon use 2 less energy. And then finally I've gone over to Retaliation. After a perfectly timed dodge, which unfortunately we don't do that much on the Bulwark, will deal 25% more damage for 5 seconds. If you do want to use one of the other pistols though, and you're interested to see what builds I use for them, I cover them in the videos on the other classes. Now when it comes to the melee weapons, there are really only two I would recommend, either the Chainsword or the Power Sword. Unfortunately the Power Fist on the harder difficulties suffers when compared to the other two weapons. I will recommend, regardless of which melee weapon you take, going for fencing weapons to allow you to parry enemy attacks very quickly and more easily than if you take balanced or blocking weapons. You can take blocking or balanced, which will normally grant you stronger weapons or greater cleaving potential, but fencing weapons will make your life more easy on the harder difficulties. So if you're taking the Chainsword, first of all, I'd recommend taking Perpetual Strength to increase the melee damage by 5%. I'd then recommend taking Swift Recovery. Heavy attacks will restore 100% more contested health and applies to its heavy attacks like the Stomp, Shoulder Bash, so on and so forth. I'll then take another Perpetual Strength to increase our melee damage. I've then gone over to Swordblade, to which, like combos, the length has been increased from 4 strikes to 5. I've then gone over to Tyrannid Slayer. Melee damage against Tyrannid enemies is increased by 10%. It would have been nice to also get Chaos Slayer, but we were limited on points. I've gone over to Minoris Slayer. Melee damage against Minoris level enemies is increased by 20%. I've then gone over to Full Throttle, to which holding down the melee attack will allow you to rev up the chainsword, increasing its damage by 100% per 1 second held. I've then gone over to Extremist Slayer. Melee damage against Extremist level enemies, so Lictors, Zoanthropes, Sorcerers, their damage is increased by 15%. And then finally I've gone up to Majoris level Slayers, to which melee damage against Majoris level enemies, so Tyrannid Warriors, Rubric Marines, the damage is increased by 10%. But if you wanted to use the Power Sword, which allows a little bit more versatility, as it allows you to switch between 2 modes by holding down the melee attack button, its default mode, known as Speed Style, allows you to perform fast hitting combos that are good at taking out individual targets, and you have Power Style, which powers up the weapon and allows for slower, harder hitting attacks that are better at cleaving through waves of opponents. You may want to adjust the build I use for the Power Sword depending on what style you like, but I tend to go for, first of all, Perpetual Strength to increase the melee damage by 5%. I then take Master of Defense. After switching the sword combat style by holding the melee button, you'll take 20% less range damage for 5 seconds. But this comes with a 10-second cooldown. Nonetheless, switching between the styles often, especially when you're not in melee combat, allows for some defensive options. You'll then have Perpetual Strength again, another 5% increase to our melee damage. I've then gone for Tranquility. Whilst in the Power Whirl stance, you will not lose control upon taking heavy hits, and you cannot be knocked back. The Power Whirl stance is whilst in the Power stance, you perform a melee attack, and then you wait a few seconds before performing a follow-up melee attack. This allows you to perform a little AoE ground pound attack with the Power Sword. You then have Slashing Blade. The Power Style combo length has been increased from 3 to 4. You've then got Tyrannid Slayer to increase damage against Tyrannids by 10%. You've then got Kill Streak. After killing 10 enemies in rapid succession with a light combo, you will not lose control upon taking heavy hits, and you cannot be knocked back for 5 seconds. This comes with a 10-second cooldown. You then have Cutting Edge, the Power Rake, which is done by holding down the melee attack button whilst in mid-combo. It will now deal 50% more damage. I've then got Extremist Slayer to increase the melee damage against Extremist level enemies by 15%. I've then gone up to Majoris Slayer to increase the melee damage against Majoris level enemies by 10%, and then I've gone down to Minoris Slayer to increase the melee damage against Minoris level enemies by 20%. But regardless if you prefer the Power Sword or the Chainsword, both are good options and can help you take on the harder difficulties. Now, as for the perks, first of all, for the core perks, you want to go for Intimidating Aura. After a perfectly timed parry, an area of effect damage wave is dealt in 5 meters around you. This allows for some AoE damage. I've then gone for Shock and Awe, the namesake of this build. Enemies in the shock area will take 25% more damage. The shock area is created by 2 other perks, which we'll talk about in a moment. The third perk is Defensive Advantage. After a perfectly timed block or parry, a shock area is created around the Bulwark for 5 seconds. This works akin to a shock grenade. It staggers opponents and they take a small amount of damage. And whilst in this area of effect as well, the Shock and Awe debuff on them will take effect, meaning they'll take 25% more damage. As for your team perks, I'd recommend Advanced Conditioning. Contested health fades 50% more slowly for all squad members. As for the gear perks, for option 1, this is down to personal preference in all honesty, but I'd take Focus Strength. The Shield Bash will knock enemies back and make them lose control for longer periods of time. I'd then go over to Invigorating Icon, which is a must perk for any build you're using on the Bulwark. It would have been nice to take Purity of Purpose to allow some AoE damage when we place our banner, but the fact that Invigorating Icon allows us to potentially heal us and our allies, it's too valuable to drop. As for the final gear perk, it's down to personal preference. If you want more offense, take Inspiration, more defense, take Glory's Shield, or if you're playing with 2 other players and not bots, Rejuvenating Effect. As for the signature perk, I would recommend taking Emergency Countermeasure, to which when our armor is depleted, a reserve shock grenade is automatically detonated at our position, which again staggers and deals damage to enemies, and on top of that it will count as a shock area, meaning the Shock and Awe debuff kicks in, making enemies take more damage. But this build is specialised on dealing AoE damage and countering mass waves of opponents. What if you want something a little bit more general purpose that can take on not only the Horde factions such as the Tyranids, but also the Sons of Magnus in the Thousand Suns faction. This is where I switch to the Blade Guard build, which to be honest is the build I tend to use the most when using the Bulwark, as it allows for offensive capabilities combined with a great defense. So when it comes to the weaponry for the Blade Guard build, it's pretty much the same as the Shock and Awe build. I'd recommend taking the Plasma Pistol, spec'd exactly the same way as we just mentioned. And when it comes to the melee weapons, I'd recommend taking the Chainsword or the Power Sword again. The main difference for this build is the perks that it uses. So first of all, for your core perks for column 1, I'd recommend Forward Momentum. After a Shield Bash, the melee damage is increased by 25% for 5 seconds. This is just a nice little melee buff. Just remember to use your Shield Bash often so you can take advantage of it. It also benefits you regardless of if you're going up against waves of enemies or tough single target opponents. For option 2, I'd recommend Scramble Targeting. If you are surrounded by 5 or more enemies, you'll take 20% less range damage, granting us some extra survivability. And then for option 3, I'd recommend Armor Reinforcement. After a non-finisher gun strike, we will restore some of our armor, again adding to our survivability. This is a very valuable perk as it allows us to easily restore our armor when we're tackling Majora's level enemies or higher. As for your team perk, again I recommend Advanced Conditioning, allowing our contested health to fade 50% more slowly. As for the gear perks, I'd again focus on Focus Strength, allowing our Shield Bash to knock enemies back and make them lose control for longer periods of time, which should it be more useful as we are aiming at using our Shield Bash more often so we can trigger the Forward Momentum melee damage buff. As for option 2, Invigorating Icon again, allowing us to potentially heal ourselves and our allies. And then for option 3, again as I mentioned in the first build, Inspiration if you are damage focused, Glory Shield if you're defense focused, or Rejuvenating Effect if you're playing with human players. As for your signature perk, you want to take Defensive Mastery, to which after a perfectly timed block or parry, it will instantly incapacitate Majora's or Extremis level enemies. This is a great perk that allows you to remove a high priority Majora's or Extremis level enemy by simply performing that parry or perfectly timed block. The downside is accidentally using this perk on an enemy you didn't mean to. Say there was an Extremis level enemy like a Lictor and you accidentally parried a warrior that came up to you first. You would unfortunately have wasted this defensive mastery by incapacitating that Majora's level warrior rather than the Extremis Lictor that you wanted to use it on. But regardless, this build is perfectly capable of taking on the harder difficulties. It's allowed me to complete lethal difficulty numerous times and is one of the strongest builds for the Bulwark. But every Astartes out there, they all come with pros and cons, despite what the Imperium of Man will tell you. When it comes to the Bulwark, its biggest pro is its survivability. It has access to the chapter banner, not only allowing you to restore your armor, but the armor of your allies as well. And then you have access to a variety of perks that increase your defense, your health, or the ability to heal yourself even by giving you more contested health. It all adds up to a class that has amazing survivability. The next perk is the shield itself. Able to block pretty much any incoming attack, bar psychic attacks. It allows you to advance on opponents without fear of taking damage. And then the final perk is, this is a class that has the ability to heal not only themselves but their allies. Thanks to the chapter banner along with the Invigorating Icon perk, it will give you and your allies a full bar of contested health, to which if you perform a finisher whilst you have this bar, it will allow you to heal all your health back. Incredibly useful, especially on the harder difficulties. But there are cons. Unfortunately, the 2 cons for the Bulwark include the fact that it does lack primary weapons, in which case it does lack a little bit when it comes to range damage, but this is a melee focused class. And then the other con is, unfortunately, if you are relying on your pistol, you may run into ammo supply issues. Like I said, trying to save your pistol for enemies that you cannot reach in melee is normally key to counter this, but nonetheless it's an issue you still need to be aware of. But regardless, the Bulwark is one of the most useful classes in the game, thanks to all the aforementioned benefits when it comes to healing your allies, their armor, and more. If you're looking for a class to take on the harder difficulties and you don't mind playing a melee specialist, I'd strongly recommend the Bulwark for when it comes to taking on the various operation missions in Space Marine 2. But what are your thoughts? Please leave a comment down below, and until next time, I've been Darcblade, bringing you my guide to the Bulwark in Space Marine 2. Hope you enjoyed the video, thanks for watching, subscribe and like for more.